You did it this morning. You did it before your first cup of coffee. You did it in the car. You did it the moment you walked into work and saw who was already there. You did it looking at a stranger on your phone. You did it reading a message from someone you've known for years. You did it just now, before this sentence was finished. And you have no memory of any of it. Not because it didn't happen, because your brain processed it so fast, so automatically, so far beneath the level of conscious thought, that it never gave you the chance to decide whether you wanted to do it or not. 200 times every single day, researchers have tracked it. The number holds across cultures, age groups, professions, and levels of education. The most self-aware person you know is doing it. The most empathetic person you know is doing it. The person who has spent years working on their bias, their judgment, their relationship with other people, is doing it 200 times a day, without knowing. Most people, when they hear that number, assume it applies to strangers, to first impressions, to the kind of snap judgment you make walking past someone on the street. That's not what the research found. The 200 daily judgments include the people you eat dinner with, the people you've worked alongside for a decade, the person whose voice you know better than almost anyone else's. The automatic evaluation system does not pause for familiarity. It runs on everyone, every time. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what that sin is, where it lives in your brain, why it runs automatically, and what it actually costs you, not in some abstract moral sense, but in your relationships, your decisions, and your understanding of the people closest to you. And you'll understand why the fact that you can't feel yourself doing it is not a coincidence. It was designed that way. There's a psychologist named Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia. He spent decades studying one specific problem: the gap between what people think they know about their own minds and what their minds are actually doing. His conclusion, documented across hundreds of studies and published in a book called Strangers to Ourselves, was precise and uncomfortable. The conscious mind, the part of you that narrates your experience, makes your decisions, holds your values, tells you who you are, processes approximately 40 bits of information per second. The unconscious mind processes approximately 11 million bits per second. 40 versus 11 million. What that means in practice is this: the vast majority of what your brain does, the evaluations it makes, the conclusions it reaches, the responses it generates, happens in a layer of processing that your conscious mind never accesses. You don't watch it happen. You don't approve it. You don't even know it occurred. You only see the output, the feeling, the impression, the sudden sense that you know something about a person you met 30 seconds ago. That output is the sin, and the sin is judgment. Not judgment in the legal sense, not judgment in the moral condemnation sense, judgment in the precise psychological sense, the automatic, instant, largely unconscious evaluation your brain performs on every person, every situation, every piece of information it encounters. Is this good or bad? Safe or dangerous? Trustworthy or not? Worth my time or not? Like me or not like me? Your brain makes these evaluations constantly, relentlessly, on a timescale measured in milliseconds. A face appears. Within 100 milliseconds, faster than a blink, your brain has already produced an evaluation of that person's trustworthiness, competence, and dominance. Not a considered assessment, not a reasoned conclusion, a verdict, delivered before you knew the trial was happening. Princeton psychologist Alex Todorov has spent his career studying exactly this process. In one of his most cited studies, he showed participants photographs of two candidates from U.S. congressional elections they had not followed. He showed the photos for 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, and asked participants to rate which candidate looked more competent. Their judgments predicted the actual election outcomes with approximately 70% accuracy. 70%. from a tenth of a second, from a photograph, of a stranger. The voters who participated in those elections had access to policy positions, voting records, endorsements, debate performances, and months of campaign coverage. The study participants had a photograph for 1/10 of a second, and they predicted the outcome at 70% accuracy. Think about what that means for every person you have ever met. The colleague you decided you didn't trust before they finished their first sentence. The person at a party who gave you a feeling you couldn't name. The stranger in a waiting room whose presence made you subtly uncomfortable without any specific reason you could identify. Your brain had already decided, before you had any information worth deciding on. Todorov ran a follow-up study that went further. He found that the specific facial features driving these judgments, the shape of the jaw, the distance between the eyes, the curve of the mouth at rest, had no reliable relationship to the actual traits being evaluated. A face that reads as untrustworthy is not an untrustworthy person. A face that reads as competent is not a competent person. The features that trigger the evaluation are artifacts of genetics and bone structure. They have nothing to do with character, but your brain responds to them as though they do, every time, without exception. This is where it gets important, because most people, when they hear this, do what the brain most wants them to do. They locate this problem in other people. They think about the biased co-worker, the judgmental relative, the person whose snap judgments have caused obvious damage to the people around them. That's the defense mechanism talking. Todorov's research didn't find this pattern in certain types of people. It found it in everyone. The more empathetic participants showed it. The more educated participants showed it. The participants who rated themselves as least judgmental showed it at rates nearly identical to everyone else. The automatic evaluation system does not care what your values are. It runs underneath your values. It was running long before you developed them. Here's why. The part of your brain responsible for this automatic judgment is not the part that developed last. It is the part that developed first. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, located deep in the temporal lobe, was processing social information for millions of years before the prefrontal cortex. The seat of reasoned judgment and conscious evaluation was fully developed. In the environment where human cognition was shaped, the ability to make fast, accurate social evaluations was not a luxury. It was survival. Is this person from my group or another group? Are they approaching with threat or cooperation? Do I have time to think about this, or do I need to respond now? The brain that survived was the brain that could answer those questions fast, faster than conscious thought, faster than language, faster than reason, fast enough to respond before the threat could fully materialize. And here is the part that most accounts of this research skip over. That ancient evaluation system was reasonably accurate in the environment it was built for. In a small group of people you had known your entire life, small behavioral signals, a shift in eye contact, a change in posture, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second, carried real information about a person's intentions. The signal was weak, but in a world where the alternative was missing a threat entirely, a weak signal processed fast was better than no signal at all. That system is still running, in your brain. Right now, in a world where the cost of a wrong social evaluation is rarely physical danger and almost always something more subtle, a misread colleague, a misjudged opportunity, a relationship that never recovered from an impression formed in the first 30 seconds. The hardware is ancient. The social environment it's running in is completely different from the one it was built for, and the gap between those two things is where 200 daily judgments live. There's a second layer to this that most people never hear about. The automatic judgment doesn't just happen, it gets reinforced. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman at Princeton, whose decades of research on human cognition produced one of the most influential frameworks in modern psychology, identified what he called System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is fast, automatic, effortless, and largely unconscious. It produces impressions, intuitions, and feelings without any sense of deliberate work. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful, and conscious. It produces reasoned conclusions, considered judgments, careful analysis. Here is the part that changes how you understand your own mind. System 1 runs constantly. System 2 runs only when specifically engaged, and engaging it costs cognitive resources that the brain is persistently reluctant to spend, which means that in most situations, most of the time, your brain does not move from the automatic judgment to the considered one. It stays with the first evaluation. And then, this is the part that makes it a sin in the truest sense. It uses System 2 not to evaluate the judgment, but to justify it. You meet someone. System 1 produces a verdict in 100 milliseconds. You then spend the next 20 minutes of the conversation finding evidence that confirms what you already decided before they said a word. The things they say that fit your initial impression, you notice. The things that don't fit, you discount, explain away, or simply don't register. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, but in the context of human judgment, it is something more specific and more damaging. It is the process by which an automatic, unconscious evaluation, formed with no real information, built on ancient social heuristics that have no reliable relationship to the person in front of you, gets disguised as reasoned assessment. You feel like you figured someone out. What actually happened is that your brain decided and then manufactured the feeling of having figured it out. There is a study that makes this concrete in a way that is difficult to forget. Researchers at New York University showed participants a series of faces and asked them to rate each person's trustworthiness on a scale. Then they showed the same participants stories about crimes and asked them to assign guilt. Participants were significantly more likely to find people whose faces they had rated as untrustworthy guilty of the crimes, even when the evidence presented was identical. The face had nothing to do with the crime. The automatic evaluation had already decided. The conscious assessment of evidence simply confirmed it. A follow-up study took this further. Researchers told participants explicitly, before presenting the evidence, that their facial trustworthiness ratings had no bearing on actual guilt, that the faces had been randomly assigned to the crime stories, that any impression of untrustworthiness from the photograph was irrelevant to the question of guilt. Participants acknowledged this, and then judged the untrustworthy-looking faces as more guilty anyway, at nearly the same rate as before. Knowing the bias existed did not remove it. Knowing did not override. 200 times a day, every day, in your workplace, in your friendships, in your family, in your most important relationships. Your brain is producing verdicts before the trial starts and calling them conclusions after it ends. Now here is the part that connects all of this to why this matters beyond the abstract. Because most conversations about judgment stay in the abstract. They describe the mechanism. They note that it's universal. They suggest awareness as the solution. And then people leave feeling slightly bad about themselves and change nothing. The research doesn't support that outcome. The research supports something more specific and more useful. A team of psychologists at the University of Wisconsin ran a long-term study on what actually changes automatic judgment patterns over time, not reduces them slightly, not makes people more aware of them, actually changes the underlying pattern. They found that the single most effective intervention was not education about bias. It was not self-monitoring, trying to catch yourself in the act of judging. It was not deliberate counter-stereotyping, consciously imagining exceptions to your automatic categories. It was something simpler and harder at the same time. Contact. Sustained, individuating contact with people your automatic system had already categorized. Not exposure, not proximity. The specific kind of contact that forces System 2 to engage, that requires you to attend to this person as an individual rather than as a representative of a category. A conversation in which you are genuinely curious rather than confirming. A relationship in which the person becomes too specific, too complex, too individual to be held inside the original verdict. The automatic system doesn't disappear, but it loses its grip on the specific people you actually know. The verdict that was formed in 100 milliseconds gets slowly, continuously revised by the accumulated weight of real information. And the capacity for that revision, the willingness to let what you actually know about a person override what your brain decided before you knew anything, is the specific cognitive skill that the research identifies as the antidote to the sin. Not the elimination of judgment, the willingness to be wrong about it. Here's what that requires in practice. Something small, something that most people don't do in most conversations. Genuine curiosity about whether your initial impression was accurate. Not performed curiosity. Not asking questions to confirm what you already think. The specific, uncomfortable willingness to find out that the person you had filed under a category does not belong there. Most people never do this. Not because they're bad people, not because they don't care about being fair, because the brain doesn't prompt you to do it. The brain produces the verdict and then fills the conversation with confirming evidence. The brain is not trying to understand the person, it is trying to be right about them. And this is where the sin lives, not in the automatic evaluation. That is biology. That is inheritance. That is a system that was running before you had any say in it. The sin lives in the moment after the verdict. In the decision, conscious or unconscious, to confirm rather than inquire. To use the conversation to validate what you already decided, rather than to actually find out who is sitting across from you. 200 times a day, your brain produces a verdict. 200 times a day, you have a choice about what to do with it. Most of the time, without knowing there was a choice at all, you confirm it. There is one more piece of this that the research documents, one that most accounts of human judgment leave out. The cost is not only paid by the people you judge, it is paid by you. A 2018 study at the University of Michigan tracked the relationship between automatic social judgment patterns and measures of life satisfaction, relationship quality, and emotional well-being over 10 years. People with high rates of automatic, unrevised social judgment, people who formed quick impressions and rarely updated them, showed measurably lower relationship satisfaction, lower trust in others, and higher rates of loneliness than people who showed more willingness to revise initial impressions. The judgment doesn't just harm the people on the receiving end of it. It keeps you at a distance from them. It prevents the specific kind of knowing, the accumulated specific individual knowledge of another person that deep relationships are built from. A brain that has already decided doesn't stay curious. A brain that isn't curious doesn't keep learning about the person in front of it. And a brain that stops learning about the people it's close to begins, slowly and without noticing, to be in a relationship with its own verdict rather than with the actual person. The person you think you know best, the one you've been close to for years. How much of what you believe about them was formed in the first weeks of knowing them and has been confirming itself ever since? How much of who they actually are right now, who they've become, what they've learned, what they've left behind, have you missed because the verdict was already in? That is the hidden cost of the sin. Not just the damage done to strangers by snap judgments you never examined, the distance it creates from the people you actually love. Here is something worth sitting with before this ends. The research on automatic judgment has been available to psychologists for decades. It is taught in graduate programs. It is discussed at conferences. It is published in journals that the people most responsible for making consequential judgments about other people, judges, employers, doctors, teachers, could access if they chose to. Most of them don't. Not because they're incurious, because the brain that would need to absorb this information is the same brain running the automatic evaluation system. and that brain has already decided it's not particularly biased. The irony is precise. The people most certain they don't do this are doing it at the same rate as everyone else. The people most resistant to the information are the ones for whom it matters most. The sin protects itself. You did it 200 times today. That's where we started. And now you know what it is, where it lives, why it runs, what it costs, and what the research shows actually changes it, not the elimination of the automatic evaluation, the development of the specific habit that follows it, the pause between the verdict and the confirmation. The question, genuine, not performed, of whether what you just decided is actually true. That pause is small. It costs almost nothing in time. It costs something real in ego, in the willingness to find out you were wrong about someone. But on the other side of that pause is something the research documents clearly. Better relationships. More accurate understanding of the people in your life. Less loneliness. More of the specific kind of knowing that makes a relationship feel real rather than assumed. 200 times a day. 200 chances. The sin isn't in the verdict. It's in never questioning it. If the real psychology behind what humans actually do, not what they think they do, matters to you, subscribe. No noise, no filler. Just the research, and what it means for the way you actually live.